Hi, everyone. Good evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you in person as well as online this evening. My name is Laura Matacoro, and I'm a historian and associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton University, which is located on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation. And as I reflect on being on these lands and on the insights that this series, Rewriting Refuge, has offered, I am hopeful that we can continue to work for a deeper understanding about place and belonging and community. This is the last lecture in this edition of the Shannon Lecture Series, Rewriting Refuge. It has been absolutely incredible to gather with all of you to learn from a range of speakers and participants who have taken us to all parts of the world, across Canada, and have invited us to consider the different ways that we might think of refuge and the implications that flow from describing a certain place or action as a kind of refuge or sanctuary. Indeed, one of the connecting threads has been around the way the movement of peoples in forced and free ways and the blurred spaces in between has invited a response or responses from civil society, states, and scholars that often encourage further change and reflection around the management of borders, the regulation of bodies, and claims to community and belonging. So although it is a seemingly simple concept on the surface, refuge is in fact a deeply entangled and multifaceted historical phenomena, and one that continues to embody individual and societal challenges in the present. It's been truly wonderful to learn about refuge from scholars working across multiple sites and multiple time periods. So I'm going to do my thing where I do thanks, but I really want to make emphatic thanks since this is the last lecture of the series. So big thank you to all the wonderful speakers who have participated, to all of the wonderful audience members online and in person, especially on this very strange Ottawa night where we've had both rain and snow in the mix of, a few minutes. And I also want to thank the original benefactor and all the people who worked behind the scenes to make these events happen. So the Shannon Lecture Series is now in its 21st year, and it is the result of a generous donation by Lois Long in memory of her parents. And Lois wished to support the department's efforts in the fields of Canadian, social, immigration, and local history. And over the years, the series has expanded these themes, all the while staying true to the spirit and generosity of this original gift. So I hope you will keep your eye on future Shannon Lecture Series events, which the planning has already begun for, but I'm not doing a big unveil. You'll just have to stay tuned. I want to thank James Miller, Dominique Marshall, and James Milner for their support, as well as to Steve Schwinghammer and Sam Mickelson. The team of administrative staff in the Department of History has gone above and beyond, as have all the administrative staff in different units across the university who have received countless emails from me announcing these events. But a big thank you to Tanya Schwartz, Joan White, and Darlene Moss. Also thanks to Gwen Davey and the team here at Carleton Dominion Chalmers Center, including Ash and Troy, who worked technical magic for the past several weeks, and I'm sure we'll do so again tonight. Nudge, nudge. And I can't think of a better way to end this series than with our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Wendell Ajeti. Indeed, in these dark days of November, before the snow makes Ottawa sparkly and bright, it can be hard to feel cheerful, but I have been looking forward to this talk for a long time, and so I'm sure the November blahs will just hit me later this week. Dr. Ajeti is William Dawson Chair and Assistant Professor of Post-Reconstruction U.S. and African Diaspora History at McGill University. He is also the recipient of McGill's H. Newell Fieldhouse Award for Distinguished Teaching and the Principal's Prize for Excellence in Teaching, two extraordinary achievements. And what the official bio doesn't tell you is that Dr. Ajeti, like all of the participants in this series, is an incredibly generous colleague and collaborator who gives much of his time and energy to advancing historical research and the state of the academy in multiple ways. He has a long career of community engagement and activism and has made a palpable difference in the lives of youth in North America and Africa. Most recently, Dr. Ajeti published his first book, Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, The Making of a Pan-African North America, which, to use his words, and I quote, maps racial formation and self-determination among North America's mixed Black population of African Americans, African Canadians, and African Caribbean peoples from 1900 to 2000. As Dr. Ajeti writes, diasporic Africans networked, strategized, created organizations, and led movements while traversing North America and the broader Atlantic world, their cross-border cosmopolitan corridor. They pursued formal and informal ways of achieving a collective liberation that would also end colonial plunder of Africa and the exploitation of the Black masses. It is an astonishing work that is being widely praised. It has been described as a stellar work of global diasporic Black history, and Russell Rickford has described it as a fascinating and original examination of the transnational orientation and border crossing practices of African North Americans in the long 20th century. So the talk tonight is drawn from this work, and we are very much looking forward to it. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Jennings.
Good evening. Good evening. There we go. As African peoples, we believe fervently in this notion of call and response. So thank you for responding to my call. Good evening. Thank you, Laura, for such a generous introduction. Thank you all for braving this very nippy Ottawa evening and somewhat snowy and slushy evening. First and foremost, I must give due acknowledgments to the Creator, to the God of my ancestors, indeed, to the covenant of my ancestors. Osabu olate, ogidi gidi, gbagbate gbate, katamanso tache, nunko nunko, bo chukwo, bo nyaga, bo buami, keje osabua, moko begbe, bo gbagbe, keje osagbagbe, moko begbe, ocheji ehi, olo ehi, onoko noko ehi, bo gbe oweyo, bo jishishige, bo jinagbe. I give thanks as well to the spirit of my ancestors. Atriko Isisaji Yancho. My name is Wendell Nilai Ajite. To my kinsmen, my kinswomen on the African continent and other parts of the African diaspora. I also go by Ni Lai Osabu the first. Atriko Ublahinka Ublaya Manche. I'd like to thank everyone who had a hand in bringing me to Carleton today to deliver a named lecture. It's quite an honor for a junior professor who's still cutting their teeth. So thank you so much. Steve, Sam, and others who had a hand in it. I'd like to acknowledge a senior historian slash statesman here, Professor Jim Walker, Emeritus. Professor Walker is, for those who don't know him, he's a pioneer in Canadian history and specifically African Canadian history, and somebody whose scholarship influenced and shaped my own. And incidentally, when I was working on my book manuscript and then convened a book manuscript workshop, Professor Walker generously read the manuscript and gave copious feedback that invariably a young historian needed. So thank you so much, Jim. It's so great to see you here. And to those who are online and those who are in this room and gathered this evening, thank you for your presence. So my presentation this evening is entitled Follow the North Star to Canada, Draft Resistors in the Underground Railroad. Follow the North Star to Canada. So this brief lecture today in many ways was inspired by chapter 4 of my book, Cross-Border Cosmopolitans, The Making of a Pan-African North America. And the objective of this book, sort of the overarching historiographical objective, was to conceptualize US history or American history within a continental, hemispheric, but also a transatlantic frame, right? How do we look at or understand US history from a vantage point that would also highlight the significance or the geographical significance of Canada, the geographical significance of the North American mainland, the geographical significance of the Caribbean basin, and certainly these transatlantic connections with actors on the African continent and also in Western Europe. So my presentation will unfold in 3 parts. The first will examine the draft resistors during the Vietnam War and the various push-pull factors that would shape the destiny of so many young men and young women as well. Part 2 will examine race and integration to Canadian society, or the Promised Land, the mythic Promised Land. And the third section will explore gender politics in the draft resistor community in Canada. And so this theme of rewriting refuge is so apropos. When Laura reached out to me, I thought, oh my goodness, I just might be able to do this, maybe. So thank you for the excellent theme on which I may speak today. I'm unsure if anyone might remember this image, but in 2016, when it seemed probable that a very buffoonish, although dangerous, sort of novice politician, Donald Trump, might just seize the White House, The Economist uses this particular provocative image on its cover. And it speaks to longstanding anxieties about the United States, right? And certainly it speaks to the ways that Canadian society is romanticized, going back over a century. That Canada is this perennial refuge point, certainly in the US imagination, specifically in the African American imagination, but also in the imagination of many radical individuals in various generations over the course of the 20th century, certainly in the 19th century. Follow the North Star to Canada, draft resistors and the Underground Railroad. In December 1969, when the United States selective system conducted enlistment lotteries, tens of thousands of draft-age men, often with their girlfriends or spouses, went into self-exile in Canada to resist the Vietnam War, as well as military draft. African-American draft resistors framed their resistance to US imperialism and US militarism as part of a long tradition of revolutionary struggle that originated in antebellum slavery. Social unrest, much of which stemmed from the perceived racial and class inequities of the draft, left few options for those whom military service, especially combat in Asia, constituted an existential moral dilemma. Depending on one's draft status, defection from the United States, or outright desertion from a military installation represented two of the few outlets for war resistors. Western European countries such as Sweden, Germany, France welcomed hordes of military-aged men and their female partners who chose to quit the United States. But Canada, a perennial refuge point in the US imagination, proved much more strategic for war resistors because of its proximity, because of its ease of entry, because of cultural resemblance, and because of the prospect of economic integration or the pursuit of material security. The flow of US war resistors from Canada, or pardon me, the flow of US resistors across the US border into Canadian cities went from a mere trickle in the mid-1960s to an outright deluge by 1970. Some conservative estimates place the number of draft-age men who immigrated to Canada from 1965 to 1972 to roughly 30,000, 20,000 of whom identified as Dodger or deserter. Conversely, the number of US resistors paralleled the number of Canadians who fought for the United States in Vietnam. In 1969, Canada received 22,785 US immigrants, the first time since 1932, during the Great Depression, that Canada received more immigrants from the United States than it sent. Most war resistors entered through southwestern Ontario, although Montreal proved a vital point of entry. In response to the sudden influx of US radicals, one commentator explained that some Canadians in the Vancouver area felt uptight, an opinion that had less to do with the immigrants' draft status or their military status and more with their appearance as quote unquote hippies. The countercultural anxieties extended beyond British Columbia. Benevolent groups that aided draft resistors processed an estimated 70% of all US expatriates in Toronto and Ottawa because of Southwestern Ontario's strong employment prospects compared to the West Coast, the prairies, Quebec, and Eastern Canada. With their government identification, some resistors drove across the border into Canada, while some flew into Canadian airports. An unknown number of draft resistors, of course, entered Canada illegally by simply walking across the border or having friends, acquaintances, comrades smuggle them into the country. Leaders in the draft resistor or refugee movement established numerous organizations nationwide to assist draft resistors and their families, while refraining from declaring Canada a haven for deserters. Such a declaration, of course, would have weakened public opinion against resistors. 12 US war resistors founded the Union of American Exiles on the 4th of April, 1968. Incidentally, that was the fateful day that MLK Jr. was assassinated. As one of the principal aid groups, the UAE had its own dedicated magazine, the American Exile in Canada, or Amex. The UAE and Amex played a significant role in the immigration, settlement, and integration of war resistors in Canadian society. The American Deserters Committee, or ADC Toronto, the Toronto Anti-Draft Program, as well as Red, White, and Black, served US expatriates in the Toronto area. I'm always amazed when I reflect on this particular moment in global history. Of course, I was not alive and was not observing these very seismic protests taking place. But it's hard not to draw parallels in terms of other major moments of acute resistance to Western militarism, Western imperialism. During the war years, between 26 and 32 organizations supported US refugees in Canada. Similar to Caribbean immigrants and Black Panthers, this influx of US radicals further contributed to the subversive climate of Canadian society in the 1960s and early 1970s. In addition to emphasizing self-help, the Union of American Exiles questioned socio-political and economic injustices in Canadian society. These were not passive guests. One of the first major cases that the UAE championed involved Robert Sherwood, an African-American radical who fled to Canada. In November 1968, Charles Henry, who was Secretary of the Workers' League, sought the UAE's support in establishing a defense committee or defense fund of sorts for Sherwood. He was charged with violating Section 50F of the Immigration Act, concealing a criminal record upon entering Canada. Sherwood, along with Dick Gregory and Martin Luther King Jr., had participated in a nonviolent protest that denounced segregated schools in Chicago. The US courts charged him $25 for engaging in what it called disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Sherwood's advocates believed that the Canadian government targeted him because of his draft status, as well as his membership in the Workers' League of Canada, and the fact that he was actively engaged in securing the rights of working poor people. Such public defenses brought resistors notoriety, but aid groups focused principally on integration and settlement services, such as acquiring employment and, most importantly, permanent residency. As unemployment increased nationally from 3 to 5% in 1970, however, many war resistors failed to procure job letters, which were a prerequisite for landed immigrant status. Under the point system, prospective landed immigrants had to score at least 50 out of 100 possible marks to acquire the coveted status of a landed immigrant. Immigration officers could award 60 of these points based on an applicant's education and employment skills. Draft resistors from working class backgrounds with minimal education or technical skills, and certainly African American resistors or African American immigrants in general, experienced greater obstacles when applying for landed status. Immigration officers wielded discretionary powers, and many exercised bias. The radical periodicals of the draft resistor community sought to connect with Canadian and US readers. Resistors evoked Canada's past as a haven for enslaved Africans, to revive Canada's image as a refuge point for the persecuted. To some readers in the late 1960s, overt references to slavery and the Underground Railroad by all-white leftist organizations seeking a broad legitimacy of sorts in their anti-war struggle might have sounded contrived. However, calculated references to Canadian free soil during the Vietnam War was precisely what the publishers of Amex and other underground periodicals believed would sway public opinion to their cause. A published manual for draft resistors, for example, juxtaposed two letters. In one written in 1853, John H. Hill, an enslaved person, recounted his escape from slavery in Richmond, Virginia, to Toronto. An unidentified draft resistor in Toronto wrote the other letter on the 10th of November, 1967. Both writers document their escapes from the United States. Both marveled at Toronto's beauty and receptiveness upon their arrival. Both expressed a yearning for distant friends and kin. Moreover, the draft resistor, much like the runaway fugitive a century before him, recalled how FBI agents, or modern day bounty hunters or slave catchers, nearly apprehended him after his induction date. US-led anti-war organizations in Toronto co-opted the 19th century narrative of Black transnational freedom struggles to signify the centrality of race and migration in critiques of US citizenship. One commentator described Canada's utopia compared to the imperialist, hawkish United States, and I quote, "I've been considering splitting to Canada to escape the draft, racism, fear of the police, air pollution, omnipresent freeways and traffic congestions, overpopulation and urban sprawl, and a few more million things I'm not too pleased about down here," end quote. The writer demonstrated a nuanced understanding of Canadian politics, and I quote again, "I know things aren't perfect in Canada either. The English pretty much control the economy and the French can't get anywhere in their corporations." This is actually a very nuanced critique of a US draft resistor of Canadian politics at that time. I digress. A lot of French want separatism, the Observer noted. To this writer, these uniquely Canadian problems seemed much more manageable than the issues facing the United States. The myth of the North Star is most potent when a liberal Canada is contrasted with a repressive United States. Historian Jim Walker calls it a liability, and I'm borrowing his words, that obstructed anti-racist policies in Canada. The North Star myth was a liability to progressive policies that could mitigate anti-Black racism. Sensing the deep disquiet among military-aged men because of the draft, Amex editors published a full poem that historians often attribute to Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. here's a cartoon that in many ways speaks to the romanticization of Canadian society, this perennial refuge point of sorts. Um, Canada might not have the sheer might, the hegemonic strength, economic prowess, political prowess of the United States, but Canada is a place where those who are persecuted long for. I'm on my way to Canada, that cold but happy land. The dire effects of slavery I can no longer stand. Oh, righteous Father, do look down upon me and help me on to Canada where colored folks are free. The Queen comes down onto the slave with arms extended wide to welcome the poor fugitive safe onto freedom's side. This direct appeal to Black radicals and Black draft resistors to quit the United States romanticizes Canada by portraying it as a racially egalitarian society and the United States as the unreformed land of bondage. No discussion of the Underground Railroad can occur without some reference to one of the most porous and fluid points of entry in the US-Canadian border, Detroit and Windsor, two cities separated by a bridge over and a tunnel under the Detroit River. The Detroit-Windsor corridor historically constituted a significant border crossing or point of exchange for people and goods. Windsor, the way station for exiles, was the home of a network that smuggled war resistors into Canada. The convenience of geography made this operation viable. Past success with Canadian officials at this location, one observer concluded, has led to the establishment of an underground network of Canadians who meet Americans seeking to immigrate at a predetermined location, drive them back into the United States, and then again to the Canadian border to process them legally. Explaining how smugglers identify prospective refugees, the article noted, the intrigue usually involves memorizing color schemes of clothing and bus depot locales. Similar operations exist on either side of the Ontario-New York border. An underground railroad, according to an internal FBI memo, operated between the United States and Canada. A former Black Panther member turned FBI informant from New Jersey confirmed that there was indeed an underground network that helped political fugitives escape to Canada, and that some proceeded to Africa or majority Black countries in the hemisphere. This informant used false identification to enter Canada, and in some cases, morticians used false identification to enter Canada, and false morticians cooperated with members of the Black Panther Party for self-defense by furnishing them with false identification to enter Canada. The RCMP suspected that such a network existed but knew little about it and was quite anxious to infiltrate it. Activists initially conceived the plan in 1969 at a Black Panther Party meeting in Nova Scotia to create underground cross-border networks. Ultimately, activists decided that Eastern Canada provided the least barriers to entry from the United States. Black militants, the FBI also alleged, planned to cache arms in Canada, identifying various hamlets in Nova Scotia. There was a real sense of struggle, perhaps revolution, between leftists and the US government. Therefore, showcasing the perspectives of African-American war resistors in leftist periodicals allowed white radicals to link the anti-war cause to the Underground Railroad and the Black freedom struggle. Iyusi Ndugu, a draft resistor from Mississippi who escaped to Toronto in 1969, said, and I quote, "He has traded in his slave name. I also traded in countries recently," end quote. This notion of Ndugu exchanging his country marks, to borrow historian Michael Gomez's words, illustrates the efforts that some Black nationalists made to reverse the deracination to which the US ruling class subjected their enslaved ancestors. Therefore, name and citizenship under the oppressive regime of the turbulent 1960s and 1970s became fungible markers, especially for diasporic Africans. Ndugu explained that upon arriving in Canada, he felt, and I quote, like a beautiful black crow who had escaped from the bullet of a farmer, end quote. Growing up in the Deep South, Ndugu heard tales about how some of his ancestors had followed the North Star to Canada. As a draft resistor who had obtained permanent residency, Ndugu, on his own accord, embraced the noble task of encouraging African American defection from the United States to Canada. Although he acknowledged the pervasiveness of white supremacy, Ndugu believed that racial hostility in Canada was much less destructive. I know that someday I will explain to other Blacks who come from the States that my reason for coming to Canada is the same as the runaway slave who came in the 19th century. But I am a 20th century runaway slave. Ndugu's declaration to cross-border radicals, specifically African American war resistors, as modern fugitives fleeing despotism, marked a watershed in the draft resistor movement, justifying why, as a draft resistor, he believed that the appellation runaway was more apt. Ndugu stated, "The reason I think of myself as a runaway slave is that I ran away from an oppressive, racist, genocidal, by which he meant educationally, physically, and psychologically, and financially, and very imperialistic country," end quote. These are the same reasons, Ndugu argued, which led his forebears to follow the North Star to Canada. At a time when Canadian officials dreaded the influx of foreign radicals, Ndugu proclaimed to his comrades that they should make Canada their new home. He wrote, "We could build a strong community of our own." Ndugu reassured African Americans that Canada, especially English-speaking Toronto, would nurture their sense of Black nationalism. African Canadians, he explained, acquire periodicals such as Ebony, Jet, Negro Digest. He identified Lenny Johnson's Radical Third World Bookstore, a well-known Toronto cultural establishment, as a place to procure African artifacts, dashikis, and everything in the line of Black identity. For Ndugu, the choice between modern bondage and the promised land was self-evident. We can look better in dashikis or African robes in Canada than wearing a green army or blue navy outfit in Vietnam. Underscoring the theme of Black self-exile and refuge in North America, he referenced the iconic Toronto soul food restaurant called the Underground Railroad, which opened on the 12th of February, 1969, which was Abe Lincoln's birthday. Although Ndugu admitted that he had yet to visit every part of Canada, he nonetheless attested that for Black people, especially Black men, the air of freedom blows a little better. This gendered statement was deliberate. As an African American with intimate insight into Jim Crow mores, Ndugu believed that his presence in Canada insulated him to a degree from US white supremacist patriarchy, a genocidal logic that seeks to vanquish subordinate males. He also endorsed interracial radicalism on Canadian soil, perhaps as a kind gesture to his fellow white draft resistors who had given him a platform to share his story. Quote, brothers, the white draft resistors and deserters are good people, people who know why our race is fighting so damn hard in the States, he pleaded. After urging other African Americans to come and dig on the scene here, Ndugu repeated his most important appeal: do like the 19th century slaves and follow the North Star to Canada. And this is a cover of the Amex periodical, which featured Ndugu's prominent article in 1969. And you can see an African-American man with an afro with some type of coffle around his neck and the Black Power salute. Some Black war resistors looked at Canada more critically. A 1971 article claimed that the mere presence of only 1,000 military-aged men of African descent in the land of the North Star indicated Canada's unwelcoming posture to Black US immigrants. The challenge, it seemed, also stemmed from the atomized and fractured experience of African Canadians. According to Mike Vance, an African American who absconded to escape his Wisconsin draft board, quote, it's just now dawning on the Black Canadians that they're Black. And they seem to look on Blacks from the States, particularly the Dodgers and the deserters, as troublemakers. African Canadians, Vance noted, lacked a critical mass and thus were not as concentrated like they are in US cities. He further criticized Black people in Canada because they are not organized and untogether, which in fact was a view that many African Canadians in Toronto shared at the time. Vance had also encountered challenges accessing support from the white-led Toronto anti-draft program, which Vance attributed to anti-Black racism. Although Vance made some plausible observations about African Canadians, he grossly underestimated their multi-layered and extensive tradition of activism. Echoing Vance's sentiments on the obscurity of African Canadian identity to African Americans, another deserter named Charlie Coates said few Black enlistees know about Canada, hence the low numbers who have fled to Canada. Quote, it's the thing of leaving home, of leaving all your people. There are so few Blacks here, and most of them are West Indians. And that's like a different culture, end quote. For Coates, the misperception that diasporic Africans, especially those of US origin, were rare in Canada led to his inaccurate conclusion that fleeing to Canada would be equivalent to, quote unquote, leaving your people behind. Furthermore, the dearth of service providers catering to Black war resistors throughout Canada mystified the presence of Black radicals in the early 1970s. One reporter had trouble contacting the Toronto Black Refugee Organization, which was known colloquially as BRO, Black Refugee Organization, which was one of the only Black-led aid groups for resistors in the city. Because of Canada's scrutiny and, in fact, hyper-surveillance of Black war resistors and other radicals, some concluded that BRO had gone underground. Jim Russell, a leading organizer for BRO, said he could not be forthcoming about journalists' inquiries because we have a policy against discussing BRO with journalists from the United States. Many of these journalists, in fact, were spooks They were FBI agents or informants. Black draft resistors operated informally and covertly. In fact, May 1970, Toronto police claimed that 24 draft resistors had found refuge with other Black people in the city who aided them and hid them from the RCMP. The Mounties alleged that the US government wanted to apprehend these men for weapons and drug offenses. This clandestine network is not as sophisticated, according to one detective assigned to the case. He further added, nor is it as effective as any of those wartime organizations, referring to the underground cells that helped Allied prisoners escape occupied France in World War II. Even with their lack of sophistication and effectiveness, some of these draft resistors use government-issued identification of their friends and sympathizers in Canada and the United States to evade law enforcement. Integrating into Canadian society proved much more difficult for Black draft resistors than for their white counterparts. After a year in the Promised Land, for instance, Ndugu sounded more tempered. The Black thing here is completely different from the whites. A lot of the whites who come here are as racist as whites in the States. Whites here are no different, end quote. European and white US immigrants brought their anti-Blackness with them, which interfaced with white Canadians' own racism. Refusing to accept anything short of complete racial equality, Ndugu declared, I won't take up Canadian citizenship. Africa is my home, and that is where I'm going. This common but often futile search for a racial utopia or refuge point in a white supremacist world is reminiscent of Claude Brown's 1965 Man-Child in the Promised Land, which by all measures was a literary classic about great migration, African Americans from the US South and their disappointing and backbreaking transition to life in Harlem. Claude Brown asked, and I quote, for where does one go when he's already in the Promised Land? Ndugu exercised agency to make Canadian society more hospitable for racialized peoples, not just Black people. In March 1970, he wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail criticizing Canadian society for publicly and unashamedly promoting a lily white appearance, notwithstanding numerous Indigenous peoples in this country, and to a lesser extent, Black people and other ethno-racial minorities. According to Ndugu, Black and Native people never appear in the advertising pages of the city's 3 largest newspapers. When traveling on streetcars, subways, and city buses, one rarely sees a Black face on the billboard, end quote. 3 weeks later, the Director of Information Services for the Department of Manpower and Immigration wrote a counter op-ed in response to Ndugu's. The director explained that the federal government had made a concerted effort starting in February of 1970 to showcase different Canadians in its advertisements. The director acknowledged the efforts of his own federal department in running a student summer employment advertisement in the Toronto daily newspapers with a photograph representing a Black, Native, Canadian, as well as white students. The director appeared to have missed the fundamental mark in his rebuttal. However, he failed to appreciate the structural roots of Ndugu's concerns. Ndugu further highlighted his disaffection with Canadian society. I can't say how many Blacks have come, but the number is very low because if you leave Watts or Harlem or the Black Bottom in Detroit and get into this, it's like jumping into a pitcher of buttermilk. Like any immigrant group, the pull of vibrant and thriving Black communities played a role in whether African Americans chose to leave their oppressive but familiar racial environs for Canada's sparsely populated Black communities. Ndugu added, "It's all white. The music on the radio, the pictures in the papers and magazines and on television. There's a race problem here, just like in the northern cities of the US." Lenny Johnson, along with his wife, Gwendolyn, co-owned Third World Bookstore and Crafts in downtown Toronto on Bathurst Street, which was a popular hangout that radicals frequented. Johnson speculated they, Black resistors, can't trust anyone and they can't melt in the city like they could in New York or Detroit, end quote. The absence of a Black critical mass in Toronto and historically discriminatory immigration limited the numbers of Black people in Canada, which, of course, deterred others from coming. The son of Jamaican immigrants who came to Toronto circa 1911, Lenny Johnson, like many of his Black male contemporaries in Canada, worked full-time as a porter, sleeping car porter on the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1940s. The 52-year-old Canadian-born Johnson believed that Canada and the United States shared certain common threads in terms of their white supremacist settler colonial foundations. Quote, "The only difference is in degree and percentage. The only difference is in degree and percentage. If there were more Blacks here, it would be the same. America's racism is raw. It's in your face. It's out of control. Here in Canada, it's covered up," end quote. According to Johnson, the problem for Black people in Canada stemmed from their numerical marginality, which subjected them, among other factors, to whimsical treatment whenever most Canadians experienced prolonged economic hardship or political challenges. Quote, "Sure, there's peace and tranquility here. There's very little in the way of overt discrimination. But the situation here is now like pre-war Germany, where the Jews thought they were Germans. They weren't, and we're not Canadians. If a depression comes, we'll be niggers again. Fascism is the real threat," end quote. Notwithstanding the political asylum that US expatriates found in Canada, one draft resistor in Vancouver underscored the transnationalism of white supremacy and the embedded colonialisms of the United States and Canada. He noted, in short, "It finally dawns on us that it's the same old shit all over again. We see that we never had an alternative to the pathetic racist culture we left behind. If we don't like what's happening to the Black man down there, dig what's happening to the red man here," end quote. For some war resistors who sought refuge in Canada, racism and imperialism illustrated limitations of the state. The racism that African North Americans, that is African Americans, African Canadians, African Caribbean peoples, alluded to in Canadian society sometimes appeared overt and unmistakable, showing its face without shame. The Canadian white supremacist organization known as the Western Guard, or which was formerly the Edmund Burke Society, which one US expatriate described as a melange of Eastern European and Canadian-born fascists who advocate for the murder of Black people and white race traitors, had acquired a notorious reputation for disrupting anti-war demonstrations. The Western Guard also committed acts of racism and hate crime against minorities. On the 29th of April, 1972, it hosted literally a hate banquet for other white supremacists in Toronto. The KKK and the Canadian and US Nazi parties or neo-Nazi parties, among others, attended. One participant indicted for bombing school buses in Pontiac, Michigan to stall that city's school integration, described Canada as the last stronghold of white supremacist culture and a place for white Americans to come if the Jewish conspired mongrelization of white and black is allowed to continue. That white supremacists also regarded Canada as their place of refuge further complicated the image of Canada as a haven for black people. In mid-March, moreover, as Roosevelt Douglas, a prominent student activist and Pan-Africanist, canvassed Toronto for his Black Community Center project, the Klan painted a white cross on his car, slashed the tires, and left an ominous note that said, "Nigger, time is up." Racism was not the only obstacle. In the war resistor community, concerns over sexism mobilized some activists. Women's rights activists voiced their grievances, given the supporting cast and lead roles that they played in the refugee community. Many women helped men publish magazines, wrote articles, and made inquiries on behalf of their loved ones. Amex, which made a concerted effort to discuss the organizing efforts of women, ran an article acknowledging the invaluable contributions of three women in particular in the anti-draft struggle in Vancouver and Toronto and their overall efforts in the women's liberation movement. Often the spouses of draft resistors, women formed their own support networks in addition to their broader contributions to the anti-war movement. In Toronto, white women such as Sandy Gaetano, Dorothy Jones, Marion Campbell, Karen Sheehan, and Nancy Goldsberry spearheaded a committee to procure medical supplies, specifically prenatal aid and birth control and baby clothing. Women shaped the draft resistor community. At the May 1970 Pan-Canadian Conference in Montreal, for instance, the women of the Montreal American Deserters Committee organized a women's caucus. These activists felt that they had been, in their words, put down and tasked with completing, their words, shit work. The lack of gender inclusion created sparks as the broader anti-war and leftist machine mobilized. Women expressed deep frustration that some of their male counterparts discounted their contributions to the struggle because they were not technically draft resistors, which some argued amounted to, their words, blatant male chauvinism. The Women's Caucus made several policy recommendations. Most notably, they pointed out that the Toronto anti-draft program should create programming that serves all US expatriates, not just men who are subjected to military service. They also requested that the resistor publications should signal class consciousness by using simpler prose and articles for those who lack formal education. Furthermore, the aid group Red, White, and Black, they recommended, should show sensitivity for women's problems such as birth control and childcare. And I'll be wrapping up momentarily. The Women's Caucus adopted a militant tone in response to the notion that women are not war resistors and therefore do not experience US imperialism firsthand. One participant responded, "Bullshit. Women lose their husbands, sons, and brothers to the military machine. As a result, women are often obligated to change their role entirely and take over as family breadwinner, end quote. She also noted, a woman's decision to leave the US is just as political as a man's, end quote. The hubris that some men exuded, according to these women, undermined the struggle. Members of the Women's Caucus believed that they could temper what they called ego tripping. Some also took aim at Canada's immigration policy, identifying blatant white male patriarchy because married women could not acquire landed immigrant status before their husbands. With the influx of US war resistors and other radicals in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a recurring and urgent debate on Canadian sovereignty and US imperialism surfaced. When US radicals made Canada their haven, it complicated and threatened Canadian sovereignty. Publishers of draft resistor periodicals vowed to expose US imperialism, raising awareness in the ways that it impacted Canada. US expatriates arrived in Canada believing that Canada was perfectible. One lamented, we have dropped into Canada ready to build a Canadian society that will be a vast improvement over the American model. We do not want Canada to evolve as another carbon copy of the Coca-Cola culture, end quote. With gradual enfranchisement for the outspoken expatriates, they challenged Canadian support for US domestic and foreign policy. Subversion of US imperialism seemed possible. As long as we have anything to say about it, America will increasingly be unable to take Canadian support for granted, end quote. As the sovereignty debate waxed, so too did the Canadian government's surveillance of draft resistors. Canadian officials conspired with their US counterparts to return refugees back to the United States. Much like the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Underground Railroad, desertion from US military service put war resistors at risk because law enforcement in Canada had no qualms about spiriting said individuals back into the awaiting arms of Uncle Sam. For example, a young man, a 22-year-old by the name of Michael Whalen, who was a white draft resistor and had deserted in June 1969 while training at Fort Dix in New Jersey, arrived in Toronto as a visitor in July. The FBI and US immigration officials, along with the RCMP and Canadian immigration, tracked Whalen's movements in the city. After overstaying his visitation, immigration officers approached Whalen and advised him to leave Canada and to apply and re-enter legally as a landed immigrant. When Whalen complied, Canadian immigration officers denied him access at the Peace Bridge border crossing in Buffalo, even though he had 3 letters of employment and $1,000 cash. Instead, immigration officials handed him over to their US counterparts for what they call safekeeping until the FBI arrived and whisked him away to the stockades. He was a deserter, so we took him, said the district director of US immigration. We gave him to the FBI, who charged him with desertion. Sometimes we tell people in Canada, specifically the RCMP and immigration, where our deserters are, just like sometimes the Canadians tell us where their people are in the US. We cooperate, end quote. As Canada liberalized its immigration policy in the 1960s, it contended with the challenges of an increasingly multiracial society. Caribbean immigrants and cross-border radicals, such as draft resistors and Black Panthers, sought refuge and linkages in Canada, notwithstanding this country's Cold War politics. At times, Black and non-Black people considered Canadian society a hospitable annex to the United States. As a haven, African American and white immigrants believed they could promote revolution in US society while concomitantly advocating for progressive change in Canada. The myth of the Underground Railroad served many purposes for Black draft resistors. It allowed them to articulate a tradition of resistance, cross-border consciousness, and a sharp critique of US despotism and anti-Blackness. For white leftists, this quintessential Black narrative of clandestine refuge making pushed the boundaries of interracial solidarity. It complicated it too, despite the endurance of anti-Black racism and capital exploitation. Thank you.
Sorry, gathering mics. Thank you so much, Dr. Jetty. Thank you, Wendell. That was truly extraordinary. You complicated so many things for us. But it was, I think, really fascinating to see the weaving and especially the narrative of the Underground Railroad in the various ways that was understood and the expectations that created and then the kinds of discipline. Thank you so much for sharing all of that knowledge with us. We have about 25 minutes for questions. So for the online audience, if you want to, I'm staring at the video camera because that's where the online audience is. But if you want to put your comments into the Q&A or questions into the Q&A, we'll have Sam read the questions in the room. And for those of you who are here, I am happy to roam around with the mic and encourage you to offer questions, comments. Otherwise, I will take over the mic.
Wendell, Erin Tully in political science. I just had a question about the treatment of resistors by the Canadian government. I mean, we know that immigration policy in Canada has been informally and formally racist.
Mm-hmm.
And was there a different appetite or desire to maybe look the other way to resistors based on racial grounds, or were they all sort of treated in the same type of way, or do you see that kind of racism playing through in how the Canadian state or police responded to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your question, Erin. So, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's administration, government, was very careful not to come across as overly endorsing the flow of US resistors. And so Canada had this sort of tacit, subtle acknowledgement and reception of draft resistors in the 60s and the 1970s.
Sorry.
Speaking of.
Would you like to use this one? I could just project. Yeah. So there was a general understanding that draft resistors were welcome, not just in Canada, but in different parts of sort of the Western liberal democracies, because the Vietnam War in particular was appalling to many governments. The perception of the resistors, of course, varied based on race. So the experience of white draft resistors, partly because they could, much more easily integrate into Canadian society more than Black draft resistors, meant that they were able to acquire the employment letters. They could tap into existing networks in order to pursue landed immigrant status, which would make them or grant them a modicum of protection from U.S. federal authorities. And of course, the challenge with Black draft resistors is that they were just hyper visible. So Toronto in the late 60s, early 70s probably had a population over 20,000, but growing rapidly as a result of immigration liberalization in the mid 1960s. The major advantage that Canada enjoyed in this moment is that draft resistors, US draft resistors in particular, both white and Black, added to Canada's sort of geopolitical standing. And this is something that I often allude to in my book and other work, is that Canada gained something that is very difficult to quantify. When you look at sort of pre-Confederation and post-Confederation Canada or British North America, Canada had moral authority in ways and leaps and bounds, principally because of this, the myth of the Underground Railroad, what historian Jim Walker calls this liability that hamstrung the nation from addressing very real systemic, anti-Black issues and other forms of racial discrimination. And so the influx of draft resistors in the late 1960s and the early 1970s added to Canada's credibility, Canada's moral authority, Canada's standing vis-a-vis the United States. At the same time, and we know through the classified and now declassified intelligence documents, Canadian national security was working, and I referenced this, was working very closely with US national security as well. And there was a particular perception that the Black draft resistors were, brought a certain contagion of revolutionary ideas, revolutionary politics that would interface with those of their, kindred from the Caribbean, who were also arriving with like anti-colonial, anti-imperial, pan-African revolutionary ideas. And so that made Black draft resistors even more vulnerable to the Canadian state.
Should be good. Yep. Just talk right into it and everybody can hear you online.
Yes, the joys of online in person. I'll pass over. It is a nice sounding mic.
Good evening,
Good evening.
Dr. Mans. I'm curious as to if your research has led you to Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic. And in his text, I am confident you found parallels with this notion of hope and change and this continued disappointment by people of African descent, especially those who were displaced through the institution of slavery, being bereft of a home, so to speak. I would also like to make an observation that some of the deserters or drafters did not conceive that Black Americans, for example, in Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, Nora Hendricks is a great example. Jimi Hendrix's grandmother had community, and there were places they could have gone on the Pacific West Side versus concentrating so much of their efforts in the East.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for the very rich data you have shared.
My pleasure. Thank you for your thought-provoking commentary.
I think there was.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really fantastic. And I'm really curious because you were the one who actually invoked, it sounded like, Claude Brown's famous Man-Child in the Promised Land. I realize that the chapter you're drawing from is really focused on this idea of the Underground Railroad, but I'm wondering if you actually found draft resistors who actually were talking more in this language and actually more in the language of the Great Migration and the disappointment with it, because there is that whole story, even from Bontemps' WPA writings, if you found that, and if you could see actually the importance of region and where Black resistors were actually coming from in terms of shaping how they viewed Canada, what their expectations were. And then won't try and ask a million questions, but when it made it possible for draft resistors to come back into the United States, did you therefore see a very similar kind of connection that you would actually see between those who had been in the Great Migration in the North and the South, that those deep connections between, that it would actually extend into Canada after it was once again possible?
Excellent. Thank you. So this very famous 1965 novel written by a Harlemite who would go on to achieve like literary acclaim, right? He was a first-time author and just knocked it out of the park. So Claude Brown, in many ways, encapsulates a yearning, right? A diasporic African yearning. And as my dear sister over here pointed out, this yearning for a promised land in the Atlantic world, right? That African peoples in bondage and in its aftermath, sort of quasi-freedom or quasi-bondage, yearn for a promised land. And so in the context of the Great Migration, in the context of the Vietnam War and resisting the draft, this this yearning was very much sort of a trope of sorts that various Black resistors invoked. That resisting the draft and going to Canada was more than simply resisting militarism or US imperialism, right? It was a fulfillment of sorts of ancestors' dreams, right? Of having a refuge point, of having security of person, having material security, right? Having a place where community could be safe from the overreach of the states, et cetera, et cetera. And so with many of the Black draft resistors, we see this with some of the white draft resistors, but certainly with many of the African-American African-American draft resistors, there was a serial migration, what historians of sort of US borderlands refer to as serial migration across the US-Canadian border, because the euphoria of Canada and of Canadian society often petered out. And so some would return to the United States because they were so connected with very serious sort of revolutionary radical organizations, from Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the Black Liberation Army. So there was this back and forth of sorts across the US-Canadian border. And in part, some of them were also involved in very real, forging very real connections with other diasporic Africans in Canadian society. And so that assets of being able to connect with people in the United States, raising capital, building institutions, networking, while evading US and Canadian national security, meant that they couldn't remain static. And so this promised land motif, and also this, this notion, and to quote Claude Brown, where does one go when you're already in the promised land? Right. And for diasporic Africans, this is, and again, Professor Walker might start blushing because I've invoked him multiple times now, but in his sort of groundbreaking book on the Black loyalists, leaving the Carolinas, Maryland, Georgia, during the Revolutionary War, when many enslaved or formerly enslaved Africans came with British forces to Eastern Canada, about 2,000 of those individuals in the 1790s would go to Africa, to West Africa in particular, Sierra Leone, right? But there's this constant, like this is sort of a recurring thread, a recurring motif in the diasporic African historiography, right? And the primary sources at least, right? Where is the promised land? Where do you go when the promised land does not materialize, right? The promised land is in many ways Jim Crow. The promised land is in many ways an imperialist outpost, right? The promised land in many ways rejects your full participation. It might accept your obsequious sort of kowtowing participation, but it rejects you fully. And so we see in the writings of the Black draft resistors that they're really contending with these questions. They're really, really contending with these questions. And in more ways than certainly I can imagine, and I think maybe a good number of us in this room, that Canada was a very hostile place. Even our metropolitan centers, these were very hostile places when you speak with some of our elders, our African Canadian elders.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments? I might jump in if I may. I'm really curious about how you came to this particular chapter and story. I was thinking as you were speaking that in the 1980s, the language around the sanctuary movement was the new Underground Railroad. So it is a term that gets evoked by all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. And I think regularly without thinking about the implications of that language. With this chapter, was the interest in teasing out, I guess I should say chapter talk. Was the interest in teasing out the experience of Black resistors? Was it to get at that problematic language around the Underground Railroad? I'm really curious about how the two maybe came together.
Sure. Thanks, Laura. So incidentally, I had one of those serendipitous encounters as a graduate student, as a doctoral student, conducting archival work. I was in the frigid state of Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, for any Americans in the room. And UW-Madison, I mean, there's some incredible public institutions in the United States, as we have many great public institutions here. And University of Wisconsin-Madison is one of those sort of crown jewel public institutions, and they have a remarkable sort of library archival system. And unbeknownst to me at the time, they had sort of received a treasure trove of these radical newspapers, periodicals from like the 60s and 70s, from draft resistor communities across Canada, like just a war chest of documentation. And I thought, thank my lucky stars of my ancestors, thank Providence for bringing my feet here. I had no idea. And so I literally, do you all know this reference of like Scrooge McDuck sort of diving into gold bullion? Yeah, I felt that's what I was about to do in the archive. I would have been probably kicked out of Madison, but nonetheless, so it was this propitious moment for me. And I realized in that moment that, you know, there were all these incredible threads in terms of thinking about US history in the way that I was imagining, this sort of continental, hemispheric, transatlantic process, that I couldn't write this history without understanding the struggle of the draft resistors, but especially the white draft resistors who are invoking this language initially, right? And literally, like if you look in the periodicals, they'll like publish a letter from a draft resistor from like Wisconsin, in juxtaposition to the writings of a black, fugitives from slavery in like the 1850s in the antebellum period. So, as a historian of the United States, I'm thinking this is a little peculiar, but nonetheless, I mean, it is such a powerful sort of metaphor, right? It's such a powerful analogy in so many ways. And so making those connections within the draft resistor community in the 1960s, because the chapter is wrestling with sort of how the United States, how activists in the United States are trying to remake the nation in the 1960s and 1970s, how Black activists from Nova Scotia to Vancouver are imagining Canada as an influx of new immigrants from the Caribbean, from the United States, are literally pushing the boundaries of a very sort of mostly lily white conservative Canadian society, with an influx of a lot of like militant, radical US politics, right, and US ideas. And so the role of sort of this chapter with the draft resistors, the refugees, the Underground Railroad, Black Power, its genesis, its the ways that it's morphing and interfacing with all these different ideas, the ways that immigration is so central to this narrative, allowed me to do much more than I anticipated. And I have to be honest, like historians, like you go in the archive, you don't know what you're going to see, and sometimes you get lucky. And I totally, like, I didn't, this was not scientific. I literally stumbled on this. Don't tell anyone.
Oh, this has invited a question.
Those are the best projects, ones that are accidental. Okay, I have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna say I want one of the things I wanted to put out there first thing is really a historiographical comment about numbers. Recently, I was talking to some actually queer activists in Toronto. My name is Patrizia Gentile, by the way. I'm sorry to introduce myself. And thank you for your talk. So I was talking to some queer activists in Toronto who have been recently critiqued for the fact that there seems to be all of this historiography around queer history that is Toronto-centric and white, particularly white, gay, male. And I happened to have an opportunity to speak to one of these activists who was active in the 70s and 80s and said, well, why wasn't there more of a connection with the Black, queer, and trans community at the time? And they said to me, well, you need to understand, Pat, like there weren't a lot of Black people in Toronto, right? So we're talking about the 70s and 80s, right? So this question of And, that kind of came up in your talk, like in different parts of your talk, the question of numbers, right? And I really think as historians, we need to start to think historiographically more about this question of numbers, especially when we're talking about Black communities in Canada, whether it's about, in this instance, that I'm giving you as an example, queer communities and this historiography about queer activism in Canada. And the reason why we don't have much to say about the Black queer communities, apparently they didn't exist, which is completely outrageous and not true. But it also is emblematic and also a testament to the deep racism and the structural racism and white supremacy of the queer community, of which I'm a member, which is one of the reasons why I was having this conversation around historiography with one of these members. So you mentioned in one of the questions, in responses to the questions, that there were 20,000 in the 60s, Black people living in the Toronto area, we're saying. But we know that because of Dr. Walker's work and Afua Cooper's work and so on, that in fact, even with sort of so-called domestic servants from the so-called West Indies, the numbers of Black communities in this country is statistically something that we need to start to uncover and unravel. So that really came up, sort of like one of the historiographical questions. So that's not, I have a question, but I actually have a question. Sorry, I just thought I was really excited about your talk. The question is really around sort of the security state in particular. Because as you were speaking, I was thinking about Ian Mackay's work on his book on the Warrior Nation, where he actually dispels, again, another historiographical error in some ways, that in the 60s, 70s, and 60s and 70s especially, we have this wonderful narrative of the Canadian nation, not just in terms of multiculturalism, but also as this peaceable kingdom in the terms of international politics and security, right? And in particular, the idea that we were the peacekeepers of the world. This was the outward. I'm really interested in how you in your talk did this work about what was, really happening underneath and what the outward facing, because that really is the paradigm of the myth making around Canadian history, which many of us in this room can speak to you about and have actually also reinforced as historians. So my question is around this question around sort of international, like you were talking about how the US and Canada had a huge collaboration around security. But in the war resistors, especially Black war resistors, in this larger context of how Canada presented itself as the blue berets of the world, we're just, here to make peace. We're, friends with everybody. But in actuality, they were, as in Ian Mackay's sort of rendering, these massive policies happening that were very much sort of Australia, Europe, US, Canada, of a security apparatus that was international and was about creating as much of a sort of a war hawkish policy. It's just that it's underneath, right? So I was wondering if in your wonderful dive into the archives, there was any of those connections you were able to see too. So that's my question. I'm sorry. You're good. Pat or Patricia.
Thank you so much. Oh, I was gonna go back here, but yep. Okay.
Just standing next
Sure.
to a mic.
So regarding your first provocation, the numbers game, and this is a very real historiographical sort of technical matter that with which historians must grapple. And, other historians, other scholars, not a historian, more of a political scientist, Keith Henry, and so many others have looked at this issue of, the demographics of the Black population, the distribution nationwide. And invariably, they've all concluded that, the Black population has been underreported underdocumented, et cetera, in Canada, right? And part of the reason is because of, as some of the scholars allude, the itinerant nature of Black people's work, especially sleeping car porters, especially the sort of the precarity of Black work as well. And so that led to an underreporting in the census records. But that numbers dynamic, I think it's very important in terms of accounting properly the Black experience. To your second provocation, Canada's countenance as this progressive, sort of peace-loving, champion of multilateralism, right? Liberal internationalism, right? All the things that would make modern Canada in the post-World War II period. Yes, so that's one narrative, and it's a very powerful narrative, and it's a narrative that, in fact, allows Canada in the post-World War II period to gain meaningful sort of moral authority vis-a-vis the United States, especially in sort of diplomatic forum, right? Principally the United Nations. But of course, there's a Canada, and I write about this in the book in chapters 5 and 6, but especially in chapter 6. There's a Canada that was heavily implicated in Pentagon and US DoD defense subcontracting and funding various weapons manufacturers. And in fact, my editors will probably flick my ear through some kind of portal if I say too much about this. But I'll share a tidbit with you. So in the 1970s, in the 1960s, when apartheid South Africa was more or less sort of excommunicated from the Commonwealth, that meant that South Africa effectively lost its privileged position of intelligence cooperation with British MI6. And not to be outdone, and not to lose any opportunity in terms of its sort of geopolitical maneuverings, that three-letter entity in Langley, Virginia, of which you all know, that three-letter entity in Langley, Virginia, was funding like heavily, a joint venture literally like on the US-Canadian border, right? In North Troy, Vermont, and Highwater, Quebec, literally like towns that straddle the US-Canadian border. And it was a weapons manufacturer that a McGill scientist, a brilliant ballistics engineer, like the most brilliant ballistics engineer of the 60s, 70s into the 80s, had founded. And so the CIA and through various entities, the Pentagon, et cetera, as well as Canadian DoD, Canada's National Defense, gave an inordinate amount of seed capital and effectively used this US-Canadian entity because it was the perfect cover to send very sophisticated ordnance, cannons, other military grade hardware from the United States and Canada to the Eastern Caribbean to apartheid South Africa. This was one of the most clandestine operations of the post-World War II period. Right? I only got access to this to like FOIA and ATIP. And this top secret initiative or top secret endeavor was intended to ensure that apartheid South Africa, Rhodesia, Angola, and other revolutionary sites on the African continent, but especially in Southern Africa, did not fall into the sort of revolutionary leftist orbit. And so Canadian officials were directly implicated, along, of course, with U.S. officials, Canadian, technical workers, were, along with U.S. technical workers, were working, in the Caribbean, specifically in Barbados, where this arms manufacturer had its principal site, where they were launching all types of projectiles to outer space, right? And Canada, and something that we don't discuss often, Canada was a significant player in terms of, Washington's global Cold War sort of anti-Soviet, hawkish policy of militarizing this entire hemisphere, especially the Caribbean basin, right? Canada was very much involved in that. And Canadian institutions, like research institutions, would often receive federal capital, filter it through these various entities, as the CIA did similarly. And so this Janus-faced Canada, right? The Canada that, of course, salutes the Blue Berets, the Canada that is espousing the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the Canada that is promoting multilateralism and gender equality and all these other things in the post-World War II, and racial equality in the post-World War II period, also had a very strategic side that most Canadians till this day know very little.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible note to end on, and maybe is a theme that we could explore in future Shannon lectures. But thank you so much, Wendell, for a wonderful talk, a very generous Q&A. And thanks to all of our online attendees and to all of you here in person for a wonderful evening and making the series so wonderful. So thank you. That's a wrap.
Thank you all. Thank you.